there is no such thing as free. None of this. Eventually, because you're like, well, I don't want to do it right now, but you get caught in the chain whip gear force of this thing. Eventually, she's gonna have an issue in the time space somewhere. So energy never created nor destroyed. But you're technically right on 33 and a third, having 666 to the physics on it and the influence of the crowd. So I'm gonna have to either dance or dance. So.
Stocks by the slice from Fidelity. Get your slice today.
The United States lags behind the rest of the world when it comes to passenger trains. But when it comes to the freight railroad, the U.S. is dominating.
Satellite.
The freight rail network in the U.S. operates over
Space Force.
140,000 miles of
Again,
privately
the
owned
F-35,
track in every state except
it's a
for
hard
Hawaii.
bird to build. I'm
It
not
moves
saying
one-third
I'd be
of all
able to
US
300
exports
IQ
and
this
roughly
thing, you know what I mean?
40% of
Like,
long-distance
without
freight volume.
real,
The North
from
American
here
Freight
to
Rail
do
Network is
hydron collider to the
considered
collision and the wave function that
most
works, and
efficient,
actually
the
putting
largest,
fallopium in a
and
jar
the most
for meeting the
profitable
God
freight
particle
rail
first.
network in the
Why?
world.
It
Because that's
competes
the one we
directly
use to
with the
line
trucking
up
industry
anything
to
else in
move
the wave
goods around the
function for the
country,
Jacobian
shipping
matrix
everything from
arbiter
coal to cars to
mean Greenwich
chemicals.
time.
And with the rise of
Time
e-commerce
delayed.
companies like
Gravity
Amazon,
waves, messing
trains are
things up
increasingly
about.
moving consumer goods
Oh,
as
but just a
well.
little bit to
If you see it on the shelf,
renormalization,
we
reset,
likely
jump
had a hand
function
in moving
on
it.
supermassive
There are 7
YF
major
over
freight
X, again,
railroads that
that
connect
33 and a
North
third
America.
to the neutron.
Union Pacific
Google,
and
everything's on
BNSF
Google. This is
dominate
on
the
Google.
West.
This is on.
CSX
This right now
and
is on
Norfolk Southern
Google,
are
even
the
if it
primary
wasn't
East
about
Coast
Google. If you
operators,
didn't
while
do
Kansas
the
City
A,
Southern,
B,
along with
C, AX
Canadian
plus all
Pacific
that
and
to be the
Canadian
stock
National,
market version
run
of this
routes
thing.
north and south. Amtrak, which is the United States passenger
Shoot
service,
a bunny right
owns
here.
only
I'm working on
3%
travel.
of the country's rail.
You can get them going however
In
you want from
2019,
it.
the top
Game
5
theory.
railroads in the
In
U.S.
the
had a
shadow of
total
it without
operating
time of
revenue of over
programmer
$71
or
billion.
engineer or
BNSF, a subsidiary of Warren
physicist.
Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, is not publicly traded,
Yeah, get
but
them
the
all out
remaining
there.
4
Like,
U.S.
so
companies
kid,
have seen
I know
their
I didn't do
stock
my
on a
video. I
steady
try
climb
to
over
mine
the
Becky
last
and
several
those two
years.
when they're
The
in the office
railroads
comparatively
are
to get
incredibly profitable.
how they
and
organize
actually
some
are
clip
achieving
rate out of here.
profits that they've never
It might have
seen
been
in
good, might have
areas.
been bad,
That
given the
unfortunately is
orientation
not
of
true
any
for
of that
passenger
lensing,
railroad.
how the
Amtrak
operator worked for the
continues
Einstein
to lose
cross
money
here,
as the
the
only major
egrosphere
for-profit
in
railroad
terms
in the United
of
States
the
that moves
horizon
passengers,
limit
and
of the
yet it
Hawking
has never made a
radiation,
profit.
which you would
The
think
future
would be
freight
like, oh,
demand
but
in this
that's heat. Well,
country
kind
is
of in the way
strong.
that it's light and
Estimates,
lensing from
30 to
that other one
40%
over there
increases
would
in freight
correlate
demand
to an
between
X-ray,
now
gamma,
and the next
burst
few
term with
decades are prevalent.
timelines that you
But the
have to
freight
separate
rail
again
industry's success has
to have the
not come
matrix
without
to
its
help you be
challenges.
able to
The
tell
industry has
when
dealt
to
with
hit that reset
bankruptcies,
and
the
how
lack
to
of demand
reset
for
that,
coal,
why this
and the
whole
more
thing
recent
has
supply chain
not the physical
bottlenecks
limit of
and
building
rise in
out to that,
thefts.
because I was
The
going to get
7
to
top
this.
railroads,
Again,
which
we're
own the
staying in the
majority of the
market.
tracks in North America, have also
Usually
been
still
criticized
should
for
do good, but if you look
monopolistic
at the
power
overall
over the rail
problem of a lot
industry.
of
They tend to be very
industry right now,
oligopoly
it's
and
up
have
and
an
it's down,
enormous
and
amount of
still
power
nobody's
and
touching that
pricing.
train.
And there isn't a
As
lot
far
of
as hopping right
competition.
into her and getting her
CNBC
going and
explores
messing
how
up the
freight railroads
timeline.
became so profitable
Everything else in
and how
good
the
square
industry
off
plans
of it
to
if it was
evolve to stay
off.
on top.
And big movies about it, with Denzel Washington, right? So, and Jim.
The U.S. railroad dates back to the year 1830, before airplanes or automobiles were even invented. Passenger rail and freight were in high demand
Oil
to
can.
move people and things around the expanding country.
For the
It's
oil
the
can.
economic backbone of the United States, in many ways plays a core and central theme in American history.
Because Mike Rowe was
and
my union
particularly
boss,
the
and he was
state
like,
of the
move. I
economy.
was like, okay,
The
Mike.
railroad has seen
Okay,
many
Mike
high
Rowe,
and
oiler
low
can.
points.
Thank you for
By
blue.
1917,
Old blue, and your
1,500
mama's
railroads
purse.
operated on
Appreciate it. You keep yelling
254,000
on the
miles
control
of
box.
track. The 40s and 50s brought the rise of cars, air travel, and trucking. Up until that point, there was basically no competition for passenger or freight rail besides other railroad companies,
right?
and the industry was subject to federal regulation that set rates and profit levels.
After World War
Again,
II,
AVE,
the
that
federal
goat in the
government
background of
built
the
this
photon
incredible
with Bob and
interstate highway
its
network and really lit trucking on fire,
Stop 45,
but
that
didn't
thing, that
relax the regulatory standards on the rail industry, even though the competition increased dramatically.
It wasn't until 1980, when the Staggers Act was enacted, that these regulations were loosened. It allowed railroads to choose routes, prices, and services, and brought profits back to the railroads. Since then, many redundant
Can you
routes
imagine
and
shooting a
railroad
guy that
mergers
could
have
use the
consolidated
mechanic
the
book that has
industry.
like every
There's a series
clamp,
of
nut,
about 5 or
bolt
6
fitting
different mergers
in it? That
that
there's a
allowed
special
Union
book. Some
Pacific
mechanic
to be
Jedi
the
went out there and
32,000 miles
figured out the
mainline track
dimensional
that we see here
analysis for
today.
the Torino
Now,
scale
M&A,
that day.
chances are that
Worked it
rail
out. Yeah.
as a percent of overall
At least
freight
figured out the X
would
for
be
it.
a
You know,
much
ideal
less
gas state
important
of
part of our domestic
what
freight.
do you got? Tractor supply.
Kansas City Southern just
'Cause
recently
on
agreed
the
to
frame
merge
right
with
here,
Canadian Pacific.
the
And
DNA
if the Surface
sequence
Transportation
of
Board
Spygron
approves,
1
it will
and
create the
2
only
for
railroad linking
Spidey
Canada,
Man's
the US,
artificial
and
silk.
Mexico.
He has to pump
Today,
out short
the U.S.
of
has
nature
some of the
doing
most
its magic
profitable
and
freight
getting bitten
railroad
by a
businesses
radioactive
in the
spiders.
world, achieving billions in profits. Passenger
Taking out the
rail, however, has
multi-wall
not
beam
seen
there.
a similar
Stop
comeback.
going.
While freight railroads have
Taking out the
invested
Green
at
Goblins.
least $25 billion
bring it back.
a year,
It's like, well,
year-over-year
I had
into their
one.
networks
They had
over the
Zach.
past
He's
several
usually one of my
decades,
nights on the
passenger
integral
rail
alphabet
has
tool,
not
and why
had
I
the
use
same
him the
level
way
of
I did, and
benefit.
just let him
When it
have
comes
free
to
roam out there with
Amtrak,
duct
the
tape in
federal
his
government
elbow and a
has
spoon.
traditionally been the primary funder of Amtrak, and the amount of funding pales in comparison to funding levels that have occurred in other countries.
Experts
Well, the
say
singers, like
geography
I said,
and
I put out
privatization
the
of the
singers
rail
like,
freight
you
industry
can pull your
is why
weight.
some consider
I'm
it to
gonna
be the
use that
most
song on any
efficient in the
problem
world.
because as far
The
as
rest of the
artists
world
putting together wave
does
function for
things
them,
quite a
they
bit
got some
differently,
bosonic
and most
harmonics
of
of
the rest of the
one-dimensional
world, the rail
gas that just
network
puts
is
it in on
nationalized.
timelines,
It
keeps
isn't
them out front of shit
owned
that you're
by
not
a
paying
particular
attention
company.
to.
United States geography is the
Because you
primary
couldn't.
reason that
First
freight
day,
railroad
raiding this
and the
deal,
freight
the
network
freight
in the
tracks
United
aren't getting a
States
job
is
doing it.
far
This is the same
superior
job.
to what you see
Get
in
this
other
thing out of there,
countries.
put it in
A
the
lot
box,
of
do
what
this
railroads
hokey
depend
pokey,
upon
put it
are
in, pull it
bulk
out.
commodities, agricultural commodities, and mining that we get out of the ground. And a lot of those materials
Right,
come from
correct.
the center part of the country. And because these are going to
Work same way as paycheck.
non-populated
Regular one
areas,
for a timeline,
rail
adjusted
is
equities
really
for the
well-positioned
distance of the
and
T
is a
numbers. Now,
far
when you don't
superior
have
mode
that
of
set to a
traffic
basic
than
system
you
of
see
one
with
of
trucks.
your crewmen
These
down
companies
here
compete
online, you
with
start
each
asking
other,
questions.
but also
Your
must work
base
together
system
and
of somebody
coordinate
breaking
shipments,
the
since there
back
is not
as some
one central
standard
owner of
inside
the
here says,
railroad.
In order for
there was a
us to
question
provide
once
service
about
to
what
our
is minimum
customers
wage?
from the West Coast
Well,
all the
what
way
is
to
it?
the East
It's
Coast,
like, so
we have to hand
is it
off
correlated
those
to all
products,
jobs in
those
Hancock
boxes,
that
those
correlate to
carloads
what
to a different
that
carrier
number
on the
is
east
and
side of the
whose
network?
demographic
Freight
are in
railroads
it?
are what I like to
Because
call
that's
the
what
middle
it would
miles.
be,
And so
regardless
when
of
you're
what
looking
you
at
think the
international
dimensional
traffic,
allowance
for
should be
example,
for
on
what
the
that
West
standard
Coast,
is.
you have
Because in a
ships
stone
bringing
mill
in
burning
goods,
rock,
and
they
those
can
are
give you
transloaded
minimum
either
wage.
directly into train or
And there's a
into
subway
truck.
standard
Train
model too, where
takes
you
the
might be
long
one man
miles, the
staffed
middle
in
miles
a
of those
building
trips,
with
and
a
then hands those off
Subway's
to
McDonald's
truck often
standard
at the
model
end of the
terminal
trip. So
position,
we all work
QED,
together as one
quantum
overall network.
electrodynamics of the
Through
circuit
the
of the
reduction of
photon on a
companies and
45 degree
consolidation,
space.
railroad market power
Penn's
has
row inside
increased.
here without
People are
gravitational waves.
occasionally
Jupiter
brought
dealing with
in
mean
front of the
Greenwich time for
regulators
what
for
comes inside
not
here, the
servicing,
pinnacle peak
but
of the
also
pinship
not charging
configurations.
fair market rates.
Smoke
They're
letting out because
constantly
that
under the
electron
lens
surge
and
pounded it
constantly
through, and next thing you know, you got a
accused
shit on the tracks in
exercising
California
more
that derailed it,
monopolistic
and
practices
Newsom's
in
out
their
there
place.
dealing with
Not so much
trying
on
to
the
figure out the
intermodal
frame
traffic,
rate, right?
which has to sort of stay naturally competitive with truck traffic, but more so on the
That
bulk
seems
goods.
late,
There
but
isn't
right.
Really
Seems late, but right.
equivalent truck competition.
Like 42 busy,
The Biden
some
administration issued an
skull black
executive order
skull
last July
cap,
that calls for
hard hat
regulation on
out
the
there
freight
getting
industry,
to it, I'm sure.
targeting a practice known as reciprocal switching. Reciprocal switching is intended to foster more competitive
The black hard
environments for
hat, it's
shippers.
like an alpha
Because
in
the
Edge
freight
of Tomorrow
companies
almost.
own certain stretches of track, the regulation would force them to open up the tracks to other freight companies, giving shippers more options of who to
That's
work
in
with,
I don't know how
and
they
therefore
play in
creating
other
a more
places.
competitive market. The
But out
practice is
here,
already
it's
common in Canada,
gravity.
and some freight railroads
found
have
it.
switching
We got 'em,
agreements,
boys.
which came as a result of previous mergers. When Amtrak was created, part of the deal was its passenger trains would still have access to tracks owned by the freight companies. Amtrak pays host
Well,
railroads
the beauty on this one is we
$142
don't have to
million
start
a
from
year to use their
Peacock
tracks.
or to Bullet
comes at a
or
time when we're trying
Iron
to move
or
as
to
much
railroad
freight as we
track. It's
can
already
throughout
done. I
the
just got to
supply
jump in
chain,
and make sure that that
and
thing's
to
living
do
at the uttermost
anything
of
that would
some
knowingly
slippery son of a
undermine the
bitch and you
fluidity of the
super
freight
trying to get my
network is
job.
frankly wrong-headed and at odds with the overarching goal of maximizing freight movement. The system works. The Surface
And then
Transportation
try to dial
Board
it in where
is
skill
in
adjusts
place
more of them in
to
there, and I
adjudicate
can do
freight
this just like
disputes
being
and
major out there.
determine,
It's like,
whether or not a
you don't get off the
particular rate
battlefield,
might
what?
be
You die, and
reasonable
if
or
you
not.
die, we all die.
The Surface Transportation
Okay.
Board, the agency who oversees
I
economic
know, but
regulation
thank you
in
for
the
telling us.
industry,
Thank you.
is
I
holding a
wasn't
public
sure
hearing
until
to
you told me.
discuss the matter in March.
Maybelline New York's new Colossal Curl Bounce Mascara. Now skip the
We're
lash
all,
curler.
we're all
Get
trying
big
to
curl
find
volume,
Tomb
no
Raiders,
hassle. Our curl
Pyramid
and
out
bounce
there,
brush
raise her
and
for it,
memory
I
curl
guess.
formula for up to